This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name's Rob. I am going to be talking to you this afternoon about the GCSE in Classical Civilization. A little bit about me before we start. I am Head of Classical Civilization at Townley Grammar School, which is an all-girls entry state grammar school in Southeast London. I've been working there for about 8 years, teaching classical civilization all that time. We've got quite a big department. At present, we've got about 100 students taking classical civilization in year 10, the mid 80s, I think 86, 84, in year 11. So GCSE classical civilization is a big subject at my school, which I'm very pleased and happy about. And excited to talk to all of you about it this afternoon, this evening. I can see from looking in the chat that we've got some people who are going through this qualification for their first time now. So great, amazing to hear that people are sort of picking it up, and a couple of people at least who have not done it at all. So what I'll do is I will talk right through all the sort of introductory stuff in a decent amount of detail. I'll try not to skim over that to cater to those, and that will cover overall course structure, but then the structure of the exam papers and a little bit about the different question types. And then I'm going to finish up by talking about some of the challenges that I think there are with approaching teaching this qualification, and then some of the tips that I have devised over the years that have worked quite well for me. And then we'll have plenty of time at the end for a general discussion. We can have Q&A. People can share their sort of best practice. I'd be really keen in that section not to just kind of sit at the front and take questions, but to have like a more open discussion. So yeah, that's the plan. Let's get cracking. So the overall course is divided into 2 modules, one of which is called a thematic study, so called because the Ofqual said that they wanted for any GCSE in classical civilization to include a cross-cultural comparison on a theme. That gives us the thematic study. And there are 2 options there. There's myth and religion, and then women in the ancient world, which is my favorite because that's the one that I wrote and I wrote the book for. And so I'm evangelical about teaching that one. And I get a bit annoyed when people say the reason they don't teach that one is because they work in a boys' school. Don't girls learn enough about boys? Why don't we try and make the boys learn about girls, eh? Anyway. But myth and religion, women in the ancient world are your 2 choices for the thematic study. Each of those is split down into 8 subtopics. And for each subtopic, you consider Greek and Roman content. And the idea is that you are learning about those societies sort of separately, but before you move on, you're doing explicit comparison of the 2.
Really what?
And that is assessed in the paper, and we will get on to exactly how that is assessed shortly.
This is on for about 45 minutes. Do you mind if I watch it? I can go. I'll go by the. No, I'll go in. Well, he's going to come in here, isn't he?
Okay. And then the second module is called Literature and Culture. Inspiring name there, largely because it involves studying, again, attached to a particular theme, elements of culture, but then literary depictions of same. There are 3 choices here. If you want more of an overall Greek course, you can choose the Homeric world, where you look at extracts from the Odyssey, and then look at Mycenaean palace culture. If you want more of a Roman flavor, you can look at Roman city life, where you look at, as the name suggests, life within the city of Rome. And then the literature is looking at some of the letters of Pliny. And if you would like to have a course which is completely split equally down the middle of Greek and Roman, then you can do War and Warfare, because that looks at the real life militaries of Athens, Sparta and Rome, as well as some prescribed battles, where you look at how this all kind of played out in real life. And then the literature is a mixture of Greek and Roman. The lion's share of the literature is extracts from the Iliad, but there's extracts from Aeneid Book 2, and a short poem by Tyrtaeus, the Spartan poet, and a short poem by Horace. So here's your course overview. You pick one from the top and one from the bottom, and that makes up your overall GCSE. They're equally weighted. So you probably want to spend in your teaching about half of your time doing either of them. I think in practice, whichever one you choose to do first is likely to take slightly longer, because you will be introducing everything for the first time. You'll be introducing elements of culture for the first time. We'll be introducing different exam question types for the first time. So it'll take a little bit longer to teach the first one than the second one. In my teaching, we do the thematic first. So we do women in the ancient world in year 10, and then war and warfare in year 11. So they do have less time for war and warfare. But we find out, we sort of generally find that it doesn't seem to negatively impact their marks too much at all.
Like you can listen in.
Okay, next up, let's talk a little bit about this document, the specification. The specification in planning your course should be your constant companion, if not necessarily your best friend, but you should plan using the specification, not using the textbooks. I say this as someone who wrote one of the textbooks, and I am financially incentivized to tell you to buy the textbooks because I get a tiny amount of money for every one that sells. But you should not use the textbook as your scheme of learning. You should not use that as your starting point, because that's not what it's for. The specification is for telling you what the students will be expected to know, and what they are expected to and what they can be tested on. The textbooks are an interpretation of the specification. They are what the authors thought would be interesting to cover, but the stuff that's in the textbooks may not be the most interesting for you as a classicist to teach, or they might not be full of the most appropriate stuff for your students with their interests and their needs and their level. It's one interpretation of the spec. What you don't want to do is to just base your work on that interpretation of the spec and not kind of think about the spec itself more closely. So let's look at it. I've taken an extract from one of the topics from Women in the Ancient World. I want to talk you through kind of how to read this specification. If you were to look at the whole page, you would see the 8 topics that comprise women in the ancient world. This is just the first one, women of legend. Most people will tend to ignore this sentence at the top and then just go straight down to the bullet points. Oh yeah, I need to know about Pandora, Helen, the Sabines, and Tarpeia, and Lucretia. The issue with doing that is, if you ignore the sentence at the top, you might not really know what about Pandora or what about Helen of Troy to focus on. These are huge stories, and you could go all the way right back to the very beginning in the case of something like Helen of Troy. And you could focus on umpteen different sorts of things. And you might end up, if you don't read the first sentence, focusing on something that is actually not likely to be examined. So make sure you read the first sentence, because this sort of tells you like what ideas we're focusing on in this topic. This is like the why we're studying this topic. The bullet points are then, and you'll be exploring this in relation to these 4 stories. So here, the depictions of women in myth and legends in Greece and Rome, including the presentation of these women, what it says about each culture's views on the nature of women and female virtue. So if I'm planning my scheme of work, I look at that sentence and I know that by the end, we need to focus on the presentation of the women. So we're going to do some work on characterization and how they're presented in the stories. And we're going to focus on the 2 key issues, the nature of women according to these stories. Like, what is a woman according to the story of Pandora? Well, she's deceptive. She's like a corrupting influence. She's very, very beautiful. She's a bit of a robot. Thinking about what they say about the nature, and then female virtue is the other key issue that you want to think about. if you read that introductory sentence, you can't go far wrong in planning what you include and what you exclude, because if you feel like you are running out of time, exclude anything and everything that doesn't relate to that starting sentence. If you've got plenty of time and capacity, then include anything that you like, really, that you find useful and interesting in relation to these stories. The specification also includes a list of prescribed sources. So when the GCSE classical civilization was being reformed years ago, the government was very keen to sort of define, what is classical civilization? What makes it different from ancient history? What makes it different from English? And what they came down on was the idea of, we look at the ancient world through an appreciation of sources. And therefore, both the GCSE and the A-level came with a sort of prescribed minimum amount of sources that would be required for study. And that's what these lists are. They are a minimum requirement. They're not a maximum requirement. The exam paper will expect that students have studied in class everything on the prescribed sources list. And therefore, questions that they ask about the prescribed sources can be quite granular. They can expect you to know, if we look at the bullet point list here at the bottom, quite a lot of detail. So things about the genre and the form and the purpose of sources. Think about elements of plot, characterization, and events and setting. When we're thinking about issues of like form, purpose, and genre, use your common sense, because there are some things that we don't really know the purpose of, but there are other things that we obviously do. So too with when the list for visual sources refers to original location. Well, for some things we just don't know that. So it's on there to be asked about when it's clearly relevant. So, for example, one of the visual sources for the women module is a wall painting called the Sappho fresco. Now, its original location is kind of important because it's in a private home of a wealthy family's house in Pompeii. It shows clearly a high class girl, like she's clearly very wealthy from what is included in the image. And so the fact that it is from this context, kind of it marries up with what we see in the source. So it's important. That's not always the case. So use your common sense really when you're thinking about those sorts of things. So that's prescribed sources. You do need to study those in class with the students because the examiners will expect them to have studied them. Additional sources means any source that is not on this prescribed source list, and you can include as many or as few additional sources in your teaching as is appropriate for your students. I think it's well worth including at least some additional sources in your teaching, because the exam paper will include a mixture of prescribed and additional sources for the students to look at during the exam. So making source work a core part of every lesson, I think, is a really good idea. And if you only cover the prescribed minimum, then I don't think you'll be getting it as much practice as you might want to get. The examiners are supposed to be very kind of reasonable in what they expect students to be able to do with an additional source, or something they've never seen before. So they won't expect the student to be able to know things about, the form, purpose, and genre of an additional source. They won't expect them to know its original location. And if they're asking the student to read into the source to kind of to identify something in the source, then it's supposed to be like blindingly obvious. Like if you're doing myth and religion, and it is a vase painting, and it's a picture of Athena, and one of the questions is, who do you see in the image? It's going to be classic Athena. It's going to be, she's got her long dress on and she's got her armor on and she's got a spear. Maybe there might even be an owl or an olive tree. Like, it's going to be really obvious. The students aren't expected to be, you know, A-level students or degree level, able to, you know, really make something out of nothing with these additional sources. The examiners are supposed to be really quite reasonable. They're supposed to be able to work out what's going on in the source using the knowledge that they will have acquired in studying the topic. At this stage, I'm going to briefly pause. This is my sort of the end of my overview of the kind of structure of the course, and then what we can take from the specification and what we maybe need to ensure we include in our schemes of work. I'm about to move on to talking about the exam papers themselves, but at this point I thought I might pause and see if there are any questions. Yes, Shaz.
Hi, Rob. Thank you so much. I had a quick question about the additional sources. So teaching Class Civ for the first time, where would I find those additional sources? Yeah, I just wanted to find out, you know, rather than teaching them sort of random sources that's kind of vaguely linked to the topic. Is there like a website or somewhere where I can go to get some additional sources to teach alongside the prescribed ones?
Yeah, so the textbooks have a range of additional sources in there. That might be a nice place to start. Also, the classics library has a fairly extensive resources bank from teachers who have shared their stuff. So you might want to have a look on there and see what other people are using. Otherwise, I think it really depends on what modules you're doing. What modules are you doing?
Myth and Religion and the Homeric World.
Oh, not ones that I personally have any experience in teaching, I'm afraid. I'm going to throw this out to the group. Does anyone teach those units and has recommendations on where Shaz could go?
Hi, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The Classics Library, certainly in there's quite a lot of stuff that people have posted from the British School of Athens that are really useful.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
I would also have a look at Laura Jenks's flashcards for Myth and Religion. They're on the Classics Library as well that you can get access to. They're stored in Quizlet.
Awesome. Yeah, Quizlet. Get it while you can. I think that they're privatizing. One of my colleagues uses Quizlet extensively with his Latin classes. I think he's aggrieved that now everyone has to pay for it.
We do.
Oh dear. I mean, surely that's been the business model from the start, right? Get us all addicted and then start charging. The first taste is free. All right, any more questions before we move on to talking about the paper?
Yeah, hi, I've got a question actually, just about, I do get a bit confused with the prescribed sources. So, for example, on the Mycenaean world, the Homeric world, looking at the key sites, it says in the topics that they need to know Mycenae, Tiryns and Troy, and then the actual prescribed sources that are given are only Mycenae and Tiryns. But I mean, surely you've got to look at Troy as well and give them all that information.
Yeah. I think the level of sort of granular detail that they're expected for the ones that are listed as prescribed sources will be greater than Troy. So I think that maybe is where you want to kind of weight the amount of time you spend. But okay. Yeah, if Troy is listed in the topics, then you would need to give them information about Troy as well. But say they wouldn't give like a diagram or a picture of a bit from Troy and say, identify this with very little kind of hand holding, if you know what I mean. Yeah,
I mean, it's the same with the mythology and religion topic with the 1.6 symbols of power. It says in the key topics they need to know the Amazonon key from the Temple of Basai. It's then not listed as a prescribed source, and yet every paper I've seen there's a sort of depiction of a panel from that particular temple that they have to be able to talk about. So it's a bit blurred sometimes, I think.
The Amazonamaki isn't on the prescribed source list.
It's not on the prescribed source list. It's one of the things that they need to look at. It's
Oh, gosh,
listed
yeah,
as the key topic, but then actually on the prescribed source, it says the Centromachy from the Parthenon, the metopes.
Which module is this, sorry?
Myth and religion.
Oh, thank God. So yes, they do need to look at that. But so the Amazonamaki frieze is also prescribed in Women in the Ancient World. And as I said earlier, I was responsible for writing that. So a minute ago, I was like, did I?
No, this is the myth and religion one.
Phew.
Sorry to scare you.
Yes. Well, maybe that's a reason to jump ship and join us over in Women. It's very fun. Okay. Let's crack on with talking about the paper then for a minute. If you do think of any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or just hang on to them for later. We'll do another Q&A after the paper. So first, the thematic paper, thematic study paper. 90 marks, 90 minutes. It is absolutely not a mark a minute. Do not tell your students it's a mark a minute. Do not think to yourself it's a mark a minute. Don't even think, oh, but a mark a minute is a handy heuristic. A mark a minute is absolutely not the way to approach this paper. I mean, think about the amount of time it takes to write like a one-word answer to, you read a question, who's Helen's first husband? And the answer is Menelaus. It doesn't take a minute. But also think about an 8-mark, let's think about like a mini essay. There are 8 marks for those, so you should only have 8 minutes. You're gonna need more than that really to do something that looks like an essay. So don't think of it in that way. Rather, here's my suggestion for what you how you split it up. We've got some people that have never even approached this qualification before. So before I sort of talk about timings in more detail, I'll just quickly explain how the paper is structured. There are 3 sections, each of which is worth 30 marks. But again, don't think of it as 3 even chunks of 30 minutes, because the different kinds of questions that appear in each of the sections mean that you need to spend a different amount of time. So sections A and B are called Greece and Rome, respectively. And they each comprise 22 points worth of short questions and then an 8-mark mini essay. Every question on the paper is attached to a source in a separate sources booklet that the students get. And the question paper will say something like study source A. Let's say maybe it's a, I don't know, a statuette of a Spartan girl. And then the following questions will all be in some way related to a topic that source could go with. So let's say that statuette of a Spartan girl, the person who was writing the paper is saying that could be used as evidence for the education that Spartan girls got. So all the questions are going to be about like the upbringing and education of Spartan girls. Sometimes you'll get a question that will ask students to look at the source and to use the source in their answer. Essentially maybe to identify something that they see in the source that shows a bit of knowledge. Other times, the question will have nothing to do with the source. I mean, it'll be on the same topic, but it won't require the student to use the source in any meaningful way. For those questions, the source is just being used as like a memory prompt, something to kind of hook into as they start to answer this new batch of questions, so they can think, okay, great, I'm orienting myself. We're thinking about Sparta for the next however many minutes it takes me to answer these questions. So I guess what I'm saying is a good habit to get your students into is start by looking at the questions and only spend time really thoroughly looking at the source in the sources pack if the question asks you to, or if you need that memory hook, that kind of way in to those questions. If you start by looking at the sources in the sources pack and just read all of those painstakingly, you'll be wasting valuable time because you might not have needed to do that. So as I said, there's 22 points worth of short questions. These can usually be answered in just a couple of words or maximum a sentence, and then an 8-mark mini essay. And that's true for both sections A and section B. Section C has 15 marks worth of analysis questions. We'll talk about those in more detail in a minute, but those essentially are questions where the students are provided with a source, and they'll be expected to identify something in the source and then to suggest what that thing that they've identified might show us, might tell us what that might mean. It's analysis of a source. So there's 15 points for those questions. And then finally, a 15-mark essay. The 15-mark essay will compare Greek and Roman, always in the thematic study. And is the highest tariff question, therefore needs the longest time spending on it. It's the most difficult question as well, because of the comparison element, because of the length, and also because it's the only question on the paper where students are not given a source in the sources insert to look at as a weigh-in or as a prompt. To sort of mitigate for that, they are given a choice. There are 2 15 markers, and they choose which of those 2 they would like to do. So that's the structure of the overall paper. Let me say briefly about how I would recommend you do timings. So when you're doing an 8-mark mini essay, I suggest between 10 and 15 minutes. In an ideal world, 12, but what student is able to manage time that well? The way I say it to them is you want to spend between 10 and 15 minutes on an 8-marker, write for 10 minutes, and then once you get to 10 minutes, start wrapping up so that you definitely don't overrun 15 minutes. I say a similar thing for the 15 marker. You should be aiming to spend between 20 and 25 minutes, right up to 20, so that you can definitely not overrun and do longer than 25. I mean, if they've left the 15 marker till the end of the paper, it's the last question they're doing, they can just spend whatever time they have left, actually. But I don't think it's always the best strategy to do the paper in order, because some students are terrible at time management, and they really should do all of the essay questions first, because not leaving enough time for the 15 marker is pretty catastrophic in terms of the amount of marks you'll lose if you don't write, if you write a couple of sentences instead of an essay. That's pretty much 15 whole marks you're just throwing down the toilet. So keeping an eye on these timings, I think, is really useful. And then for the analysis questions, all 15 marks worth, I recommend spending about 10 minutes. In my experience, students overwrite in their answers to the analysis questions. They treat them like an essay each, which is a really bad idea. In a minute, I'll go through sort of guidance on how I recommend to my students to answer these questions in a way that saves time. But what that then leaves you with is between 25 and 40 minutes to answer all of the short questions. If you had 25 minutes only to answer 44 points worth of short questions, you'd probably be pushing it. If you left a full 40 minutes, you'd be able to do those in a really leisurely way. So I think we're aiming for somewhere in the middle. Students can't get into the habit of using the full 15 minutes and the full 25 minutes every single time. Otherwise, they just won't have enough time left for the short questions either. The literature and culture paper is quite similar, but with a bit of difference. So there are only 2 sections here. The first one's called literature. The first one's called culture. The second one's called literature. And those 2 sections have an identical structure. They have 22 points worth of short questions, an 8-mark essay, and a 15-mark essay. Like the thematic study, there's a choice of 2 15 markers for each half of this paper. The difference, though, is students are spending a little bit longer of their time here working on writing essays than in the thematic study, where they're spending more of their time on shorter questions, including analysis questions. What this means is they need to stay even more on top of their timings when they're writing their essays, because if they use the top end of the range, they're leaving really not enough time for the short answers. If they use 15 minutes for each 8 marker and 25 minutes for each 30 marker, they would leave themselves with only 10 minutes for all of the short answer questions. That's 44 marks worth of short answer questions. That's not realistic at all. I think what they want to be doing for these is more aiming, but sorry, they want to be aiming more to be spending 30 minutes on the short questions, which means writing for the 8 markers and the 15 markers closer to 10 and 20 minutes than 15 and 25 minutes each time. The literature and culture paper, by the way, does have analysis questions in it, but they are mixed in and amongst the short questions, as opposed to the thematic paper, where the analysis questions are separated and it's really clear which ones they are because they are in section C alongside the essay. Right, I'm very briefly now going to talk about the different kinds of question, and then we'll take another pause to take questions. So analysis questions have 2 different flavors in the thematic and in the literature and culture. In the thematic study, they are worth multiples of 3 marks, whereas in the literature and culture, they're worth multiples of 2 marks. The way students get marks for these questions is as follows. They always can get 1 mark for identifying a relevant detail from the source they've been asked to look at. So if the question is explain a way in which Virgil emphasizes Camilla's femininity in source I, they will need to look at the extract from Virgil's Aeneid and pick a specific detail. And I think the more specific, the better, because they get the same 1 mark credit for quoting a single word as they would for quoting an entire sentence. Also, it's easier, I find, to analyze a single word than it is to analyze a whole sentence, because what you tend to do then is you just kind of end up sort of reiterating, kind of explaining what the sentence says rather than reading into it. So a nice specific quote or a close paraphrase of a small bit. And that goes for visual sources as well, like a visual quote. Don't try and describe the entire image. Select a particular detail from it. And then there are 2 marks available for analyzing that detail. So what the examiners want to see is like a 2-step thought process. They want to see this detail, which shows, which further implies. And so I suggest that students follow this structure here. Bullet point, quote, dash, this shows, then they say something, and then a further development on that with some connective like which suggests, which means, which further implies, which could mean. Getting them into the habit of doing this, by the way, with a bullet point and a dash, I find gets them away from thinking of it like an essay. I said earlier on that students really like to overwrite on these, and they write a first sentence that basically just rewords the question, and then they do a whole nother sentence that says the detail, and then a whole nother sentence does the analysis. The amount of time they waste there really adds up. So I think structuring it like this really briefly helps them to still get the mark, but to cut down on that kind of fluff, that wordiness. The only difference in how they answer one in literature and culture is instead of there being, sorry, I should say 1 mark, analyzing the detail, is that the analysis doesn't need to be developed. They can just say a more straightforward analysis, a 1-step interpretation of the detail to satisfy that mark. They still get the first one for picking a detail, and then they get a second one for saying something about it. So that's the analysis questions. Now on to essays. I don't have time in this session to go into essay sort of structure and bigger picture how to answer essays. So I'm just going to focus very briefly on what are some of the pitfalls, the potential pitfalls with these different question types. So the 8-mark mini essays will ask students a question, and then they'll say, use this source as a starting point and your own knowledge. And if you look at the mark scheme, here it says in level 2, sound, mostly accurate knowledge and understanding of the classical sources using both those given in assessment and own wider knowledge. So even here at one of the lower bands, they need to be using both the source they're given and bringing in facts or other sources from their revision of this topic. If you compare that with level 1, it says it may only make use of the sources given in the assessment. So if they only use the source in the assessment, or if they ignore the source in the assessment and do not mention it, they're providing in terms of this first bullet point, a level 1 response. And in these, marking these, it's not possible to get a level 1, but it's got really good discussion, so it drags it all the way up to like a 5 out of 8. You've got to go with the line of best fit about where the bullet points go. So if your top bullet point is down here in level 1, even if your bottom bullet point is up here in levels 3 or 4, you can only really pull it up to the bottom of a level 2. So you're only really looking at a 3 out of 8. So big pitfall with these 8 markers. Absolutely make certain that students are in the habit of starting off, say something about the source, then move on and show off the wider knowledge that they have about this topic. The habit I get my students into is they start every essay with from the source, and then they discuss what they see in the source first, and then they say from my knowledge. It's a bit clunky. It's not an elegant way to write an essay, but it really reminds them that that is what they need to be doing. So if they're in the habit of writing it in that way, even though it's not a very elegant essay, they satisfy the requirement. Next up, the 15-mark essays in the thematic study, as I mentioned earlier on, are always going to ask students to compare Greek with Roman culture. If we look at the marking grid here, 1 bullet point is for A01. The first assessment objective is knowing stuff, broadly. The specification puts it in more fancy terminology than that, but it's basically what do they know? And A02 is what can they do with what they know? Analysis, discussion, evaluation. In 8-mark essays, it's evenly split between the two. So if a student has really good knowledge, but they can't really do a discussion to save their life, they aren't hit quite so bad. However, in the 15 marker, if what they give you just shows loads and loads of information, but they're not really analyzing the information, they've not said what it shows, they've not explained how the information relates to their point, then they get hit twice as hard because there are 2 bullet points here for AO2. And also, if it's a thematic question, if it's a comparative question, in order to meet those bottom 2 bullet points, they really do need to be comparing throughout. The examiners don't like seeing one mini essay all about Greece and then another mini essay all about Rome and then comparison only right at the end. They like to see comparison throughout. So getting students used to thinking about the question, identifying what the issue of the question is, and then using that as a starting point for their thinking so that they've got like a more thematic paragraph in which they can include Greek and Roman content, and then a comparison of the two really is the way to access the higher marks in a comparative question. And that is true in the thematic study. It's also true in literature and culture, where the questions don't have to be comparative, but sometimes they are. Yeah, that's basically just the same. Okay. So that's my whistle-stop tour of the assessment of the paper structure. I'm going to pause again at this stage for a brief questions and discussion, if anyone has questions or anything they want to say.
Rob?
Yeah.
Hi, it's me again. Is there a particular order that you get your students to answer the questions in the exam?
For me, it depends on the student.
Okay.
I think the ideal way to answer the paper, if students don't struggle with time management, is in order, because the short questions should be easier.
Yeah.
And the essays should be harder. So the short questions serve as an on-ramp to the more challenging questions. So by the time they're writing their 15-mark essay, their brains should be really warm.
Yeah.
Also, they will have just spent time looking at their sources pack that they're given in the exam. So chances are they might be able to find a way to make one of those sources relevant to the essay question, which would be great. But it is so disastrous if they don't leave enough time for the 15-mark essay. So if they struggle with time management, I suggest maybe they do the 8 marks first and then the 15 mark, and then go back to the short ones, because you can rush a short question and have an okay go at it. You can't really do that for an essay. When it comes to literature and culture, I recommend that you get students to think of the two halves of that paper as completely separate from one another. Think of it as 2 exams that they just have to do in one time. So they need to like ruthlessly police their time, and 45 minutes for one, 45 minutes for the other. And I suggest they start with the one that they are the most comfortable with, because they'll have a nicer time doing that one, and they maybe will feel a bit more confident before they then go to the other half.
Great, lovely. Thank you, Rob.
No probs. Okay, grand. Well, if there's no more questions, let me go into key challenges, because I'm aware we've only got about 15 minutes left. Sorry, whenever I do training, I always talk too much and never leave enough time at the end. I'm working on it. So here's some things that are challenging. First, deciding what order you want to teach the thematic study. There are 2 broad ways you can do it. Either you can do all Greece, do all 8 topics for Greece, and then do all 8 topics for Rome. A good thing about this is that it helps students to keep the Greek and Roman content separate in their minds, because they've not kind of interleaved it so much in their studying. Another advantage of it is when they go back then to study the second society, typically I start with Greece and then go on to Rome. It's just personal preference, I guess. You could do it the other way around if you wanted. Whenever you are teaching the second topic, the second society, you get an advantage to kind of revisit the material from the first society after a bit of a gap. So linking to the benefits of spaced retrieval practice, that might be a good thing. The other way of doing it is do each society within each topic. So teach women and legend, or legendary women, and then you do the Greek stories and then the Roman stories. Do young women and then do Greek stuff and then the Roman stuff. That's what I personally do, because I find that it allows for direct comparison of the societies sort of within each topic, and I think that prepares them nicely for the 15 markers. Also, I found that when we experimented with doing all Greece, then all Rome, while students could remember the headlines for the Greek content, the finer detail they'd sort of forgotten. And so going through the second society took more time, because I was essentially having to reteach the first society in order to then get them to do any meaningful comparison. So I found it works better for me and my students doing one topic, Greece then Rome, the second topic, Greece then Rome. But it does come with the significant drawback that they do get confused between the 2 societies. Which brings me on to my next challenge. How do you get them to keep Greece and Rome separate in their minds? I've got a couple of strategies for this. First is color. So if you have lots of colored paper and a big printing budget, you could put all of your Greece handouts on one color and all of your Rome handouts on another color. You could get them to use a particular colored pen or a particular highlighter for one society and stick to it, so that when they go back through their notes, the yellow pages are all Greece and the red page of the pink pages are all Rome. That works really quite well. I've actually produced for my students work booklets with kind of key information in there and key activities, and every page that's got to do with Greece has got a symbol in the corner, and then every page that's got to do with Rome has got a different symbol in the corner, so a symbol code. But I think trying to find visual ways of keeping it separate really helps. And then the other thing is just regular testing. Get them to do like quizzes where you're only asking, is this Greek, Roman, or both? To try and revisit stuff and keep it separate. If you work in exercise books, one option might be to give them completely separate exercise books. This is the Greek one, this is the Roman one, so they are physically separate from each other. Or if you use folders, maybe just get them to use sections and divided sections, so that they know that everything in the front is Greece and everything at the back is Rome. That might help as well. But yeah, trying to keep things physically separate, regular testing, and color coding is some ways that I found that worked really well. Next up, how to get through the content. These GCSE courses are full. There is lots and lots to learn. So coming up with creative strategies for making the most of class time is really important. And here are just a few of my main ways. So first up is don't read necessarily through all of the prescribed literature. If you look at what the spec says that the students need to know the versions of the, say you're doing myth and religion, and you need to know the Homeric hymn to Demeter. You need to know that version of that myth really well. You don't need to memorize it word for word. So you could, instead of getting them to read what is quite a dense bit of text with some challenging vocabulary, you could summarize it maybe in a flowchart. Or you could do, as I've done here with Aristophanes' Assembly Women, which is prescribed in women, and I've given plot summaries and then extracted key scenes that we're going to do close analysis of. You definitely want them still to be reading, the genuine stuff and getting that practice of working with challenging texts. But sometimes with the longer sources, it can be a bit of a slog. And there are also bits that you can tell, well, this is in there, but I would really struggle to imagine what question they would ask about this kind of section that would be relevant to the topic, but it's kind of in there because it's in the original version, So if there's a bit like that, so for example, in women, there's a big chunk of Livy that's set for the story of the rape of the Sabine women. And in the middle, there's a big bit about Romulus's like military tactics and maneuvers, and he goes and has a bit of a battle with not the Sabines, but some of the other peoples. I don't read that with my students. I explain to them that, elsewhere, Romulus is doing this. And so they know that that's part of the story. But like, if the examiners are setting good questions that are focusing on the things that the specification says they should be focusing on, they won't use that section, even though it's prescribed, because it's not really got anything to do with what the topic is supposed to be focusing on. So those bits I typically don't get students to read, and that cuts down on time. Also, I don't get my students ever to draw anything. They don't draw tables, they don't draw Venn diagrams, they don't draw out storyboards. I do sometimes get them to illustrate little stick figure storyboards, but I never get them to do anything that involves a ruler because they just take so long. It takes ages. You give them 15 minutes to draw a table and fill in the table. They spend 12 minutes drawing the table. So I just make sure that everything like that is on a printed handout. And then I also make really good use of homework time by doing a lot of flipped learning, especially when it comes to the literary sources. Especially this works for the literature part of literature and culture, where it's just literature. I've recorded little bite-sized videos of myself reading the text to the students and kind of pausing to explain bits, pausing to ask questions of the students, and they then pause the video and write down an answer. The kind of, class reading that you would spend a lot of time doing in class, but that you might not actually have a lot of time for. I sort of shunt all of that to the home so that we can then discuss, consolidate, and then practice using that knowledge in class. And a good way of making sure that students actually watch the video is to require them to make annotations in their booklets, which you can then check. But also you might even want to set up a little kind of 2 or 3 question self-marking Google form quiz that you get them to complete, and then you can very easily see who has and who hasn't actually done the viewing. And then finally, associated with how do we get through it all is how do you keep it all fresh? Because if there's a lot of content, chances are you haven't got a tremendous amount of time for revision. So one of the ways is making sure that you do spaced retrieval. So call back to previous topics as you're teaching a new topic to try and keep that stuff fresh. And if you think of your curriculum as a spiral curriculum, that will really help. Whenever you're teaching a subsequent topic, think of ways that you could relate the topic you're currently teaching to what they already know, because doing that will get them to revisit it and you kind of get a 2 for 1. Lots of low stakes tests like quizzes I really, really recommend Blookit as a platform. So you set up a lot of multiple choice questions, and students then answer the multiple choice questions, and doing so gets them, well, it depends. There's lots of different games that you can set them up doing. Their favorite is always Gold Quest. You basically answer a question and you get to open one of 3 chests. And the chests sometimes give you points. The chests sometimes let you swap points with someone else. So they really like it because even students who are the weaker students have the opportunity to like swap with the top scoring kid at any time. So you're never without a chance of winning. And you can do that in class. You can also set it as a homework and require students to do X amount of time on a Blookit. Some of the games don't work that way. Some of the games you do have to do all at the same time, but others you can set as homework, which works out really nicely. And then finally, extract key details from sources in first teaching. I aim for students to not have to revise from their prescribed literary sources booklet, because it just takes so long. But if in your first teaching, you're getting them to extract key examples that support key judgments. So here is what I give them when we're studying Camilla. Here's a table. Here are the judgments I want for them to find examples for. They then revise from the table rather than revising from the actual text itself. And they're far more likely to actually do it then, because it's easier to look at a table and kind of try and memorize these examples than it is to go back to one of these quite complex literary sources all on your own towards the end of your course. So that kind of brings me to the end of my challenges and top tips. We've got a few minutes left together, in which I'd be happy to take any questions that people have, or if people wanted to share things that have or haven't worked for them, then that would also be great. So yeah, floor's over to you all. You've all been quite quiet and shy. That way you've all left halfway through and just been too polite to leave the call. Come on, someone must have an activity that has worked really nicely, or that completely bombed. Like here's an activity that I tried and thought it would work but didn't work. Like,
can I ask one? Your table in the, well, what I can see, the bottom right hand corner, that's Camilla's characterization. I think it says judgment. It's very difficult to read. How did you come up with those list of 6 topics?
Oh, so I prepared by reading through and having read the sentence at the top of the spec thing for that, to kind of keep in mind the sort of things. I literally just highlighted, annotated it like sort of as I might have done, back at uni.
Okay.
And then sort of took from that, well, these are the judgments that I have found, like it's possible to reach these judgments. I streamlined by picking the ones that I thought were most relevant to the topic. And then what's not shown here, because this is only the top half of a portrait page, at the bottom then I always leave 2 or 3 rows blank, because I want for students to be able to come up with their own ideas as well, not just try and find evidence for mine. But it's like it's a differentiation thing. The students who are weaker and who are much less confident will struggle to do that. So they need the scaffolding of like, here's the judgment, and then the more able can do it on their own.
All right, brilliant, thanks.
No problem. Okay, well, if there aren't any more questions, and if no one's too keen to sort of share about their own experiences teaching this GCSE so far, then maybe it's best that we call it a day.
Rob,
Tom?
I had a really quick question. Last question.
Go for it.
So roughly how long does it take you to teach both units
I have 3 periods a week of 50 minutes each, and it takes and up to an hour's worth of homework a week. And I'll usually set a homework, maybe not as long as an hour, but half an hour maybe is fairly typical. And it takes pretty much up until Easter of year 11 to cover it all.
Okay.
But then again, I've always known that that's the amount of time I've got, so I do cover an amount of additional sources. There's definitely like stuff that could be trimmed away from the way I teach to make it quicker, but I think much less than that, and it might be really challenging. How much time do you have to work with?
Well, I see my year 10 class twice a week, and we teach 100-minute lessons. So
great, you got loads of time.
Yeah. So in terms of like the Odyssey unit, we're about to finish that. So we've got book 22 left to read and annotate. And then after Christmas, I was thinking I could start the material sources, the material culture, which then will give us, that will probably take over, well, perhaps 2 terms to complete that, and then start Myth and Religion in summer, and then revisit it in year 11.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, I'd say I've not got personal experience teaching the Mycenaean palace culture stuff, but from looking at what is on there, I imagine it might not even take as long as 2 terms. But if you manage to get through the Odyssey so efficiently, you might be able to kind of keep up that pace, and then maybe spend a meaningful chunk of that summer term starting Myth and Religion to leave you with more time to then go back and refresh in year 11.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, because I'll be teaching the material source for the first time. I'm not sure how long it will take them to, grasp the sources and talk it through with them in a kind of meaningful way, analyze the images, take notes for each image. But I think, as you said, probably a term will be enough.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that will help is like to set yourself up for success. Make it so that the students have to do as little like mechanical stuff as possible in the lessons. Give them structure sheets and things to annotate and tables to fill in, so that it's really structured. Because I think one of the things with those sites that I've heard colleagues speak about struggling with is of how much there is, and because the sites themselves are quite big, you can't. Your brain sometimes struggles to take it all in all at once. So giving some kind of structure to that in the lessons, I think, will set yourself up for being able to tackle them more quickly.
Lovely, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And I've got a question here in the chat from Jenny. When do you start practicing past papers? Do you do them? I don't get them to do full past papers very often. Largely because, as I said at the beginning, I've got huge cohorts and they take so long to mark a full paper. But I get them to do exam style questions from the very beginning. They kind of are introduced to the different exam style questions, all of the different exam style questions before Christmas, and they've had a go at each of them by then.
Okay, thanks.
And Jenny, yeah, absolutely. At the end of the call, just stay on.
Thank you.
I was just going to say one thing about Myth and Religion that I'm trying is that last year I was teaching it for the first time to year 10. So I did it in the order in which it appears in terms of, the topics. But this year, now that I'm doing it again for the second time with year 10, I'm actually doing it in a slightly different order, which I think will work a bit better. So putting gods and goddesses, then do temples, then do festivals, and then go back and do the kind of the universal hero and the foundation story. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, playing around with the topic order, I think, would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds very, very sensible to me. Much like the the textbooks are just sort of, you know, one person's interpretation of the spec. The actual spec and the order that is you know, just one person's interpretation of how that content might be ordered. The way you've described it to me there sounds utterly sensible. So yeah, I hope it works for you.
Well, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, good luck with it.
Thanks.
All right, well, if nobody else has anything else, Tom, did you have anything that you wanted to say before we bid our participants goodbye?
Not in particular, no, just a massive thank you for showing up today. I hope you found it valuable, and just to keep your eye on any sort of comms from the CA or Classics for All about any sort of future CPD opportunities that might be available.
Awesome. Thanks very much. Right, lovely to present to you all. Thanks very much for coming. Hope you found it useful. I believe Grania is going to be circulating the materials from today. My email's on there as well, so if you've got a specific question, do feel free to drop me a line. I'll try and get back to you.
Thank you, Rob. Take care.
No problem. Have a good one.